Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar about measuring what you manage, brand measurement. We're going to wait a couple of minutes just to allow more people to come through. In the meantime, please, in the chat, it would be great if you could put your name, your institution, and where you're joining us from. And within the chat function, if you do want to broadcast your message to everyone, be sure to have two everyone versus two hosts and panelists. But hello to those who said hi to the hosts and panelists. It is great to meet you. Great, got some people from all over. Dallas, Texas. We've got Creighton University, more from Texas. Great to see you all. Hello from New York. I'm also in New York. Hi. All right. Great. I think that's given everyone enough time to come through. All right, well, then we're going to get the webinar started. Again, hello, welcome. It's incredible to see so many of you joining us today. We're really grateful that you've chosen to spend this next 45 minutes with us. My name is Murray Simpson. I am the Vice President of Growth at SimpsonScarborough. And today is really the end of an era. We are presenting the final chapter of our 2024 CMO study, all focused on measurement. Some of you are already using the chat function. Please feel free to continue to use it throughout. Really use this as an opportunity to connect with your peers on the common trends and challenges that you have. And if you have any questions you want answered by our team, please just use the Q&A function that's available in the Zoom. Now, this year, for those who are joining us for the first time, we've created a hub for this year's study, which you can visit on our website. There were 3 chapters before this. The first one was on budgets and staffing. The second one was on job satisfaction. And the third was on higher ed websites. So you can catch all of them on the website listed here and also gain access to the full reports. As for today, I am co-hosting with Emma Miller, our Director of Analytics and Insights, and Ria, our Vice President of Research, Analytics and Insights. Ria and Emma lead many of our research projects in the higher education sector, and they've been living and breathing this data that we're going to be showing you today. So a big thank you to both of them for joining. So I'm going to start by just giving a bit of a background into this year's respondents for the CMO study. All data in our report comes from 4-year not-for-profit institutions. We've actually been doing this study for 10 years now. And this year we had our highest ever responses with 268 institutions taking part. And the real beauty of the CMO study is we get to see how US higher ed is changing over time. So we're going to start this webinar by looking back at the headline finding from our 2019 and 2021 study to see how far we've come when it comes to measurement. So since 2019, we've been asking the industry whether they have measures in place to track their brand strength over time. In 2019, 50% said yes, and in 2021, 51% said yes. Now, we thought that this year, in 2023, 2024, with there being more financial pressure to bring in tuition revenue, that this would go up. So let's test it. Did this year the percentage go up of institutions tracking their brand strength? The answer is no. In 2023, only 47% of institutions said they have measures in place to track their brand strength over time. So it has actually decreased by 4%. Now, there's many theories on why this may be. We have a theory. Over the last few years, we all know that enrollments have been declining. There's a lot more pressure. And many institutional leaders are really focused on filling numbers for the next intake versus the longer term view of the brand. And this is a huge risk for the future of marketing for our institutions. So when we saw this statistic, we knew that presidents and cabinets have a huge role to play on whether a brand is measured. So after we saw this, we really wanted to understand what they're asking you for when it comes to your brand, if it's not about enrollment. So we sent this question out to all attendees of this webinar. Beyond enrollment, what are the key areas your leadership inquires about concerning your brand? And hundreds of you responded. And I'll be honest, we were a little bit worried about your responses at first. We've definitely seen some real zingers when it comes to the questions that leadership ask marketing teams. You know, things like, why can't we just make a viral video? That's going to solve all of our enrollment challenges. Or let's try and be more like the students themselves. Let's choreograph a music video. That's definitely going to convince students to study here. Or one of my favorites of all time, why don't I see our marketing adverts? To which marketing often give a very blank stare and repeat for the 100th time that leadership team, you are not our target audience. That is why you don't see our adverts. Now, I'm sure some of those relate to people in the room, but the great news is it really feels like these questions are becoming fewer. 80% of you said your leadership asks you specifically about the measurement of your brand, but measurement of your brand has many facets. And the component your leadership asks you most about was the brand's reputation. Awareness came second, and in last place was perception. And this is where we start to pick apart what brand measurement actually means. So we then asked you, as the marketers, what you wished you could measure. And the most important metric for you was perception, specifically the perceptions of students, alum, and the wider community. Awareness came second, and reputation was last. Now, when we compare these side by side, it's very clear that the leadership and presidents have their own priorities and marketing have theirs. It's not a surprise that leadership are likely focused on reputation because it speaks to all aspects of the institution that they're accountable for. You know, reputation could be the quality of the curriculum, the graduation rates, and the wider impact the institution is having on society. And for marketers, perception is something that we can really change with our marketing efforts. Our audience's perceptions inform our brand strategy, the content we produce, and the mediums that we use. But the truth is, these are all important. Our brands are about far more than just perception or just reputation. We need to be measuring all of these pieces because a brand with a great perception but no awareness can barely expand. A brand with lots of awareness but a terrible reputation doesn't attract. And a brand with a great perception but a poor brand experience will never survive. So we have to measure all of these to truly ensure we're making the right decisions to ensure our brands thrive in the future. But where do we even start? These are a lot of pieces to measure. So Ria and Emma are going to be discussing models for measurement in a moment. So we can discuss this and you can take practical applications back to your campuses. But before that, we have to look back at how the measurement landscape has evolved and the changes that have happened in recent years, which are really going to impact what we do next. So let's go back a century to the early 1900s. John Wanamaker, the originator of Macy's, famously said, "Half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is, I don't know which half." And whilst things have moved a lot in a century, the reality is we still don't know how much of what we do is working. So I thought let's go back in our time machine and jump back to the 90s, where a lot of digital tracking really began. I'm hoping some people feel nostalgic looking at some of these pieces. So in the 90s, it really was a Wild West era. It was a lot less about capturing data and more a simple count on how many people were visiting our websites. We call this the hit counter era. You can see at the bottom, those famous hit counters at the bottom of our website pages, they were all the rage. And it was a constant battle between institutions to publicly tally the number of visitors, with that sometimes being the biggest indicator we had of a brand's awareness. We then progressed into the mid-2000s, where tracking was really starting to be taken seriously by the major players. Urchin started as an internal tool to actually predict bandwidth billing based on the number of visitors to a website, but it quickly grew into something more. Many of you may be familiar with the term Urchin. It's those UTM parameters you see in your web analytics. That was bought by Google in 2005, and it rapidly became one of the most popular tools for website traffic analysis. And so we call this the analytics era. It was born, and it became a free service to the world, giving everyone access to start looking at how people were engaging with their brands. Then there was the rise of social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, which really changed the game. Some of you remember our old friend Tom on MySpace, who created an obsession with developing online profiles, and we coined this the social media era. This is where tracking likes and shares became a new metric of engagement. That 90s hit counter was no more, and it was replaced with the number of followers as one of the leading indicators of a brand's awareness. And then the channels started to gather a lot more information on you. We call this the showing off era. It was where your interests, your likes, your location, and your other behaviors were all being captured online. Many people were voluntarily giving their data away. You know, we wanted to show off our lives to everyone on the internet. And the brands loved it. They right at their fingertips, they had the ability to target, retarget, and gather so much more information from cookie data that many audiences weren't even aware was being gathered. And that all really started to change in 2007. Things started to feel a little bit creepy on the internet. So we have coined this the creepy era. It's where the world shifted from a tell everyone everything mentality to a what are you doing with my data and why? All of a sudden, people demanded more control over their data, and there was a need to explicitly give consent for a company to have access to your data. And as a result, we've moved into the privacy-centric era. I would say we've moved backwards as it comes to our ability to track and measure rather than forwards. We don't have as much data anymore. And you can see the timeline here. In 2018, Europe set up a privacy revolution with GDPR, which could land companies with huge financial penalties for breaking laws. Then the rest of the world followed suit. CCPA in 2020, Apple, Meta, and TikTok updated their privacy policies in 2023. And coming up, we've got Google's consent mode and the NJP Act coming up in 2025. So we're really witnessing an era now where measurement, tracking, attribution, it all needs to be redefined. And we're in a world now where we're moving more and more in the direction of needing to explicitly gain first-party data on our audiences. That means we have to proactively get more data with consent from the users. That means it's more time-consuming. It means it requires more investment. And yes, that means getting more creative about how we capture data from our audiences. But without it, you'll be making decisions without data and run the risk of moving backwards rather than forwards. So what are we doing about it? Well, with all these measurement changes coming into effect, we've been developing a brand equity model where CMOs can quantify those all-important metrics. So for the remainder of the webinar, Ria and Emma are going to dive into the rest of the findings from chapter 4 and relate these back to tangible ways in ways in which you can better measure your institution's brand using this model, or other ways in which you can measure these facets yourselves. So I'll now hand it over to Emma, who will go through the first aspect of understanding your brand's equity along with our first finding. So Emma, over to you.
Thank you, Murray. So our first section is going to dig into the marketing communication health, or MarCom health, aspect of our brand equity model, which measures what your institution is doing. Now, there are a lot of aspects that make up the health of your MarCom team, but the area where we're going to be spending most of our time is all about how your MarCom team integrates with other units and departments in your institution. So this leads us to our first insight. Collaboration is important, but integration drives the health of your brand. So what we mean by this is we wanted to see how CMOs integrate with other departments, and we saw this very clearly in our CMO data. When we asked what kind of discussions CMOs are involved outside of Marcom, we see that 88% are involved in discussions regarding recruitment strategy. A mix of 66 to 65% are involved with employee morale, DEIB initiatives, and student experience and affairs. 57% are involved in alumni relations strategy and 54% in fundraising strategy. Now, the involvement of CMOs in decisions beyond Marcom signals the recognition of the multidimensional nature of branding by aligning branding efforts with institutional priorities and areas. However, with the majority of CMOs heavily involved in recruitment strategy and less so in alumni relations, it begs the question if brands are being fully expressed with all stakeholders, potentially indicating a disconnect between prospective students and alumni when experiencing the brand. So we wanted to dig more into this idea of integration. And we have two key data points that sound similar but tell us a very different story. When asked about coordination on campus, we saw that 8 in 10 institutions report that their marketing communication efforts are coordinated on their campus. However, when we ask about integration, we're seeing a different story. When asked about the integration of their efforts, only 6 in 10 institutions agree that their marketing efforts are integrated across units, and those units being undergraduate and graduate recruitment, retention, fundraising, and alumni affairs. So this tells us a few things. A lack of integration between Marcom and other departments leads to a couple of challenges. As we saw in the earlier chapters of the Higher Ed CMO study, centralization of Marcom is key, as operating in silos can lead to disparate messages and disparate marketing strategies. Lack of integration undermines the efficiency of marketing efforts, but also restricts how the brand is expressed. Operating in silos also complicates how institutions are understanding the combined impact on key metrics such as enrollment, alumni engagement, and fundraising. The lack of Marcom integration really increases the risk of incomplete or inconsistent data, which can in turn damage the institution's overall brand perception. So to truly measure Marcom health, CMOs should focus on leading integrated brand efforts across campus. So what does this look like right now? A really good example is Arizona State University. Maybe we're not surprised by this example. While we, as in SimpsonScarborough, doesn't have deep knowledge of how their Marcom team operates throughout the whole institution, it's clear by looking at their charter, which is we are measured not by whom we exclude, but by whom we include and how they succeed, and comparing that charter against all their own digital and social assets, their stories, and their initiatives. It's also evident where they spend their time and investments. A really good example of this is that ASU has a research and data arm called Ed+, where the sole purpose is to improve the latter part of the charter, how they succeed, by using data and insight to improve student success. So this is all mapping back to ASU's ethos of innovation and inclusion, and it's something they prioritize through every aspect of the institution. So how do we get into an integrated state? One of our first recommendations is for institutions to conduct an organizational assessment. So we recommend this because it helps you understand your strengths, weaknesses, and where optimizations need to be made. We would also want to dig into the structure and resources available to you and your competitive peer set to help inform your needs. From there, we recommend identifying facilitators whose role is to facilitate communication and projects between Marcom and the different units to ensure integration is happening. So a good example of this is that we recently conducted an org assessment with a regional public in the South. We found a lot of areas of critical need, but one of the most important areas of critical need is that this institution really needed a more proactive and strategic goal-aligned initiatives, along with fostering more key relationships in the institution that are really aligned to the university priorities. We evaluated some peer institutions and kind of looked at how they were set up and the number of staff members they had. And based on that and the university goals, we recommended an ideal org chart that included the optimization of any current staff and new hires to really help support the need for more integrated and strategic department. We also took it a step further and evaluated this institution more deeply with their aspirant competitors. So this institution in particular has a desire to crack into the top 100 publics. So we're able to look at the sample of those institutions who are already in the top 100 and compare to our client. And this led to two key findings. So the first one is on the left-hand side. While our client had the majority of the key Marcom roles, the client was understaffed by almost half compared to the aspirant list. The aspirant list had around 50 Marcom staff members, while our client had 23. The second is on the right-hand side, which is all about marketing and communication budgets. This client had some of the lowest Marcom budgets compared to their competitors based on their enrollment. They have an enrollment goal, I believe, of 25,000. So we marked where they would need to ideally be in order to get to that enrollment goal. Now, this data helps us understand directionally that in order for this institution to achieve its goals, more staff and budget is needed to help their integration efforts and tell their brand story more fully across all stakeholder groups in order to reach that goal that they have. In addition to auditing your Marcom team, we also recommend creating a measurement framework by aligning Marcom strategies with department objectives by setting shared goals and key performance indicators that reflect both Marcom and institutional priorities. So as Murray mentioned at the beginning, we are seeing institutions negating long-term brand building for short-term and reactive gains. When thinking about what we want to measure, how we want to measure, and why we want to measure, we should think about the full brand funnel of a higher ed stakeholder, starting all the way from attracting at a prospective student phase through the brand ambassador phase as an alum or donor. This is where our measurement framework needs to start when thinking about the types of institutional goals that address higher ed's different stakeholders. A good example is with a client we are currently working with. This measurement framework in particular maps out their institutional goals, which is to increase positive perception and advocacy of this institution by the residents in the state which they are in, and increase undergraduate enrollment via RFI applications and matriculation. So this all trickles down to our campaign and marketing goals, which is to increase the awareness of the direct economic and personal impact this institution has on the individuals and communities in the state, increase positive perception and advocacy of the residents in the state, and increase the consideration of the institution. Aligning the department goals to the institutional goals will not only help buy-in, but also help with more effective measurement of marketing efforts. From there, this is where the integration with other departments is critical. Once there is alignment and buy-in with the goals, the other departments can be included into the rest of the measurement framework by the way of KPIs and targets. This helps with a systematic, structured, integrated way to track and progress towards these goals. So to recap, we just talked about how the structure of the marketing and communication team and integration with other departments is critical to the success of our branding efforts. Ria is now going to talk to us about brand health and how brands are perceived.
Thanks, Emma. So I'm going to build off what Emma just shared by taking us through our second insight, which is that overall institutions struggle to consistently measure and track brand perception over time. Through our study, we learned that 1 in 2 institutions have measures in place to track their institution's brand strength, which means that the other half, in essence, don't have the measures in place to do so. And truly, it isn't a reflection of whether institutions feel it's not important to measure brand health. I think we can all agree that it is, and that institutions continuously face the challenge of consistently reporting on their strength. But more so, this metric is a reflection of that complex ecosystem that exists within an institution and campus that presents those hurdles in integration efforts that Emma spoke to, which also results in why this metric is not as high as we would want it to be. And what that does manifest into is a misalignment of sorts, right, of brand strategies and missed opportunities for a deeper engagement with our key stakeholders, whether they be on campus or off campus. And speaking of key stakeholders, our results did show that most institutions do engage with their audiences and they do conduct research with them. In fact, 6 in 10 have done so in the past 3 years. And a good chunk of those, so 65 to 78% of these institutions have conducted research on their internal audiences. So here I'm talking about current students, faculty, staff, alumni, all research done over the last 3 years. But when it comes to our external audiences, speaking of parents of current students, parents of prospects, prospects themselves, and general public, they are falling behind. The percent conducting research on these external audiences is much lower. This, in our opinion, is a lost opportunity that does need to get tapped. It can provide much value in allowing us to be ahead of that curve by listening to the market that's in your pipeline and understanding the expectations, or to expectations and needs, and perhaps evolving our efforts and messaging to meet those needs. Now, I do want to make a point. Murray, if you don't mind going back to the prior slide, we did ask this question keeping 3 years, a 3-year time frame in mind, which means research on these audiences the percent would have been even less frequent if we narrowed that time frame to even more, from 2 years or even a year. And this infrequency in engaging our audiences and in understanding their perceptions, combined with the fact that we do live in a frantically evolving digital age, where a TikTok video, for instance, can impact perceptions in a matter of minutes, it does suggest a need for a more consistent and frequent measurement of the brand influence and reach. To us, this means there's a need for a consistent, more frequent, and holistic means of measuring your brand's health, and one that is inclusive of both internal and external audiences. And what does that lend itself to? You get a more comprehensive strategy that could inevitably enable us to compete actively and perhaps even proactively. And oftentimes we found that institutions use primary research, right, to do this. By using surveys, we get a snapshot of their brand's perception and health, which is totally fine and appropriate. At the same time, it would behoove us not to acknowledge the fact that primary research through surveys is valuable, of course, but it can be limiting. There are many schools of thought here on how there is selection bias in who responds to surveys, that we're missing the point of view of folks who are not survey takers. I tend to fall into the camp that really enjoys intel, which basically means let's gather as much gossip from all sources and get the download on how folks are talking about us behind our back or off the top of their minds. And in research terminology, what that would translate to is we prefer to complement the survey research metrics with the other sources of information like earned and social to measure perception. For example, how is media covering the institution? What's their reach and influence? How is the institution being captured in social conversations? So it is our recommendation that institutions could benefit from taking steps towards incorporating earned into their measurement framework that Emma briefly walked us through earlier, because let's face it, survey takers are not the only ones who have opinions about our institutions. And how do we go about doing that? And nothing gets the point across better than a schematic and an example. So here we have one. I'm showing an example of a custom approach to brand measurement. Institutions are different, as we did see from all the list of attendees in this webinar as well. There are many kinds, right? There's land grant, public, private, R1, teaching focus, HBCUs, and the list goes on. And their strategic priorities differ accordingly. So what is a priority to a small liberal arts college like Smith College in Western Massachusetts would be starkly different to a land grant R1 university like Purdue in Indiana. So to us, that means we need to quantify how those strategic priorities of your institution surface in earned and social. And it's not just sufficient to quantify it. We can take that a step further and create a custom scoring framework that combines the earned metrics that's specific to those priorities with the survey metrics from brand health and come up with a multi-dimensional baseline score that is unique and relevant to your institution. And the fancy schematic on the right is just a visualization of how we envision this mixed approach of blending survey metrics with earned and social metrics can be and perhaps should be synchronized to yield a competitive and consistent tracking over time. And especially more importantly, I think that one that aligns with your own planning efforts. And that's how we envision a holistic and consistent approach to measurement panning out. So I hope you can see how custom approaches such as this is very powerful in yielding a more complete picture of your brand in tandem with that brand health metric from surveys, but also because it aligns particularly to your institution's strategic priorities. So thus far, the insights from our CMO study have shown how the Marcom team structure supports integration efforts. And in terms of brand perception, there's a need for a consistent holistic measurement that's needed. And even But I would say that even with having the right structure and the right holistic, consistent measurement plan, there's still something missing that is exemplified in our last and final insight, which is about measuring and reporting on an institution's impact, not just on our stakeholders, but also on society and community at large. And impact, as we all know, is kind of where the crux is. Short-term perceptions can change at the mercy of a viral post, but long-standing perceptions, the kind that we know stand the test of time, are influenced by impact stories and storytelling. And it is measuring this elusive piece of the puzzle that institutions struggle with. We see that 2 in 3 CMOs rely on reporting overall marketing performance to institutional leadership. But these traditional performance measures are one-dimensional at best and don't truly convey the full story in demonstrating the value and influence of our branding and marketing efforts. And this results in an understanding gap, right, especially as we report up to our leadership of our true impact. And they tend to focus then on reactive tactics that lend itself to short-term goals, but not so much on that long-standing perceptions that we want them to lean into. We also have 3 in 5 institutions stating that they do not have a reporting system in place, let alone one that illustrates the intangible tie between branding and the impact of institutions. So that's a huge gap and a challenge that needs to be addressed. And I think this quote captures the predicament CMOs find themselves in quite accurately. Our biggest challenges includes developing a meaningful live dashboard that captures our performance, focusing on compelling outcomes rather than high volume output, and keeping the brand aligned and integrated despite our centralization. And to be honest, when we ask the question, why is all this important? Yes, we want to be able to effectively communicate the impact and value of our institution to leadership. But inherent in that is also a self-serving need. We do want to ensure we are continuing to elevate and showcase the value of your Marcom team and the contributions it makes. So we believe that the measurement framework that we referenced earlier plays a critical role here. Our recommendation is to ensure that when we track and measure traditional brand health metrics, institutions do a better job of capturing the ways in which you are moving the needle on enriching community and society. So our measurement framework therefore needs to evolve, especially to capture that impact. And the question then arises, how do we do that? So first, some self-reflection is kind of important here. Let's think about what makes sense as a tangible impact that your institution is making. Now, this could be something that you are striving for or already doing quite well. And 2 examples come to mind. Chico State here, where the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education named it as a top performer in sustainable practices. Another example is Indiana State University, which is ranking in the top tiers of the nation when it comes to social and economic mobility indices. And once we have these impact elements identified, it's a matter of ensuring that we actually integrate those impact goals into the measurement framework we referenced earlier. And I'll use an example to illustrate how this plays out. So here, say we have a client institution who wants to be known for making a direct economic impact in their state. Their impact goal could potentially be to increase local economic development in the state. And they intend to improve growth of the local economy and community by supporting small businesses, fostering entrepreneurship relationships and efforts, so on and so forth. And then we move into measuring this goal through alignment on impact metrics. Perhaps that is documenting the number of new businesses created in the state, jobs created, and the economic contribution generated to taxes or revenue, and the job placement of students. And there are many more economic impact outcomes possible. I'm wondering if the slide has frozen. There we go. Thank you. And as a resource, speaking of economic impact outcomes, we're providing a link to this New America blog post, which has a great summary of the impact metrics I was talking about that universities can and have used to showcase their impact. So I think it's a great resource to tap into if you intend to explore this further. And of course, the final piece is what's the point of all of this if we can't show off a little bit, right? So let's showcase our impact efforts by publishing an annual report that illustrates the economic impact made. citing specific businesses supported, jobs created, hours volunteered by our student athletes, among other things. And many institutions like Baylor University here, they do publish social and economic impact reports, but it is very seldom tied to that measurement framework we referenced earlier as the North Star to drive that brand perception and that brand impact storytelling. So we need to do better. We need to do better at illustrating that direct tie. It enables us to communicate to institutional leadership, particularly on what true brand value looks like for our institution. And I know at this point that we've went through quite a bit rather quickly. And while these measurement frameworks and impact metrics will vary institution to institution, I hope you can see how we can move away from using vanity metrics all the way through to measuring brand impact. And it is truly that final piece of the puzzle that provides a truer picture of that brand performance while demonstrating our value to the community and society. Again, all while being facilitated by our integration efforts through our Marcom teams and that consistent holistic measurement plan. And now I will pass it to Murray to take us to the finish line.
Great. Thank you, Ria. Apologies for my poor slideshow management there. I was too busy listening to what you were saying than taking my click cues. So apologies.
You're all good.
Okay, so thank you so much to our panelists. I just wanted to say at the end that this year we are inviting a small number of institutions to take part in our brand equity beta. And as you can see from this webinar, those three components, they can be quite complex to measure back on your campus. And our researchers have been tirelessly building this model over the last 2 years. And excitingly, we're now ready to test it. So if you want to get your hands on a lot of the data that we've discussed today, please email the hello@SimpsonScarborough.com email address. And for those institutions who are selected, we would really like to put our methodology to the test. We will assess your Marcom health through a benchmark assessment, your brand health through an already created survey instrument to your students and alum, and your brand impact, which we will do through the secondary sources. Our goal in the development of this brand equity is to really test the scores, visualize these with our analytics team, and get your feedback as a trusted friend on how these metrics and insights can be improved over time. By being part of the beta, we're really looking for institutions from diverse range of publics, privates, small and large, to ensure we're creating relevant benchmarks. Our long-term output is a centralized dashboard that will visualize your brand's equity over time, which solves many of the issues that we've highlighted throughout the survey today. Here's just a prototype example of just one of the dashboards we're looking to test and get your feedback on. So again, if you're interested in joining the beta, please shoot an email over to hello@SimpsonScarborough.com. You can email me, Murray, msimpson@SimpsonScarborough.com as well, and we will arrange a time to chat. And then just one final plug before we move into the Q&A. On June the 11th and June the 13th, we're going to be holding our CMO Lab event in Pittsburgh. You can find the link to the event on our homepage. We have less than 10 spots left, and that number is going down every day. This event is exclusively for lead marketers at higher ed institutions, and it's really a place to connect with your peers and the higher ed community. So take a look at our website and register before we fill up. Okay, we are now going to close the presentation portion and begin the Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and move into the chat. I can see the chat's been quite active throughout the presentation. Ria and Emma, are there any questions that we have not answered yet that you'd like to start with?
Yeah, I did see one come up about what do you recommend as the frequency for brand impact reports? And I think our point of view is that a brand impact, especially the initiatives that we're talking about, they are long-term, right? And they affect long-term perceptions. And so we don't expect there to be much fluctuation in it. And I also think sometimes that depends on the priorities of your university. I would say maybe once a year, if not twice or once in 3 years would be reasonable when it comes to brand impact.
Great. I have an if there's no other questions, I have an open question for the group. How do you balance setting expectations with leadership on measuring short term versus long term? Like how do the marketers in the room justify that importance when there's such direct enrollment challenges that need to be solved? What kind of thoughts or recommendations do we have there? Emma or Ria, any thoughts?
Well, I would go back to what the mission is of the organization. I think one thing about brand impact is that it goes back to the mission of higher ed, which is impact in society and communities. So I think that is one way to set the expectation of how we're measuring brands. It does, aspects of it do get at that short term measurement of some of those marketing and branding efforts. But when we think about the true value of a higher ed brand, it is that impact part. So I think it's really talking through and setting the expectation of what we're measuring and why we're measuring, and again, going back to the mission of the institution.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I think also part of that is like lining it up to that measurement framework and setting that expectation up front and continuing to use that as the North Star through your conversations. I think it continues to get buy-in. The more we reference it, the more we go back to it and keep that as the end goal in sight.
Interesting. Someone's just wrote in the chat, you need to have an enrollment marketing separate from a brand marketing team. That's so interesting, isn't it? I think that difference is important because it keeps up the prominence and importance that these are metrics that need a focus and should not take advantage over the other. The key important part there, though, is that those two things are integrated, going back to finding number 2 from our CMO study, because if we've got enrollment marketing going out with their own messaging and brand, and those things don't tell a consistent story between the two, we run the risk of something that's out in the market that's quite disparate. But that's a really, really interesting point to raise. We have also had another question come through. Someone has asked about best practice dashboard tools when it comes to measurement. And I know we've probably all worked with various tools, haven't we? So I don't think we necessarily have a POV as an agency on that. But from one of the questions, it looks like people are using Looker Studio as a tool for measuring Google and paid ads. Things like Sprout for social and muck track. We've seen other tools. Akiro's been used a lot for measuring CRM data in Slate and aligning that to media data. That's a tool that we've been using. I mean, Power BI, Looker Data Studios, I think they're the typical ones that we're seeing that are being used. Ria, Emma, do you have anything to add to that as well?
No, I think you've covered pretty much the high frequency ones that we've heard.
Yeah. There's also obviously Google Analytics as well. I think part of this is bringing it all into one place, you know, and I think that's the area that institutions really want to get to. Okay, are there any other questions that we've got in the chat?
Yeah, there's a question in the chat, Murray. Jim asks, are there authoritative resources that can be shared with institutional leadership to help them understand the long-term trajectory and goals of brand marketing? Quite open-ended.
Ria or Emma?
I'm trying to dig deep into my library, Mind Palace, to see if I can think of any authoritative resources.
I know. Oh, go ahead, Marie.
I was going to say, I think in terms of resources to show why it's important, I think we do have our CMO study data, which I think leads
it's longitudinal too.
Longitudinal, shows the emphasis that's going on. I'm trying to think if there's anything that shows ROI, right? That's the piece that our higher ed marketers need. It's the language the presidents and the cabinet speak, and it can be quite hard to attribute a lot of that. And I think really, James, the big reason for that is institutions haven't yet quite figured out how to align. If our brand score goes up, our cost of acquisition, our cost per lead, our conversion rates go up. And so often, in my opinion, really the authoritative way of justifying that is to say when we start measuring it, we can show it. And that then justifies the investment in it in the first place. And that's the hard part, I suppose. Okay, any other questions that we've got in the group?
Yes, I think there's another one on someone works in a large college within a very large state university, and any recommendations on how to get brand insights specific to my college. So yeah, there are definitely ways to do that. It does involve some custom research. And I know budget and time and through primary research can be an issue there, but in addition to qualitative, quantitative work, I think part of this earned and social is also ways to kind of figure out if there are more nimble ways to get data. And again, that also depends on the volume of conversation that is surfacing about that specific college. So I would say taking an approach that's very specific to discovery, qualitative mixed with quantitative, and if the budget allows for it, and then extending it to earned and social. Emma, do you have any thoughts since you've done quite a bit of secondary work?
No, I think that covers it.
Yeah,
There
there's
is okay.
Sorry. There's a comment here about how the immediate need of funding is obviously a hurdle when it comes to some of these efforts. And I do think that that's where I think being a mixed method or exploring mixed method or different sources of information is some ways to mitigate that. We do live in a digital age where it does allow for it now. If you think back to traditional market research, back in the day, you would do surveys and then you do phone interviews, all of which like compounds the budget. And I think the more we move towards somewhat of a leaner measurement framework that allows to get different sources of information, I think we're moving in the right direction, is what I'm saying. As a category, as an industry, we're definitely moving in the right direction that would hopefully empower individuals on campus and to make that case.
I also just want to highlight that when we think about measuring the impact of a brand in higher ed, we also have to think about all the stakeholders that we have. And higher ed is interesting because our stakeholders a lot of them are like on campus and we have direct access to them. So yes, there's challenges getting some money for research and budgets, but if there's times that we just want to understand and take a pulse of how people are thinking or feeling, I think we can easily tap into current students, alumni, to really understand, what they're thinking and feeling, and use that to catapult some research, or use that to kind of help build a case for why more research is needed.
There is a question here around whether there's anything additional we can share around brand impact and how that is measured, or the methodology behind that. Ria, I know you spoke a lot about some other examples that were in the webinar itself. Is there anything else that you want to speak to around brand impact that might help institutions as it comes to measurement?
I think it's about secondary information that's out there about your institution, where you're thriving, like I mentioned. Those are just like concrete examples. But I think even iPads, how you're performing, the spends, the impact that you're making through some of those, and even data collected in terms of, your alumni association may have some great metrics that they're sitting on. So I think it's a tie-in about making it customized to your institution, as well as having that integrated model that will allow you to feed into those data pools from your different entities in your institution. So it's by no means an easy effort, which is probably why these reports are put out once in 3 years or once in 2 years. So we recognize that. But I think our push here is to use that to make the case for that bigger long-term perception and reputation. So the data exists. It probably is sitting on campus somewhere, that just needs to be integrated and brought in.
I think this is why, as part of our beta, we understand it more, because you can have great Marcom health, right? You could have lots of staff, you could have a big advertising budget, You could have a great brand health, people are aware of you, they've got good perceptions of you, but if your graduation rates are low and if your impact on society is low, then what more can marketing do? Right? Like you've got the awareness. So I think from our perspective, it's really creating that shared accountability of the brand success. You know, brand impact, that's why it's from those secondary sources. And we really don't want leadership to forget about that, right? Not everything is marketing's fault. And that is sometimes the big message that has to come back. And it's a collective effort. It's not just about blame. It's, do you know what? We might do better as an institution if we can improve our retention rate on campus, or if we can improve our graduation rate. And that's partly why brand impact is so important. Okay.
Murray, there's a question in the chat that I'd like you to answer out loud, if that's okay. Is the beta open to colleges, schools, colleges of business, engineering, law, etc., or only university like central teams?
Yeah, I think we're really looking for a diverse range of institutions. So if you are from a college or faculty, please still register your interest. And we're going to look across the board and look at it from an institution by institution basis. So yeah, please do email their hello at, and we'll get back to you on whether there is a good fit there. For us, the beta is really that opportunity to test and reiterate. So we're looking for people who are willing to give us feedback as we move through those 3 metrics. So yeah, I think as long as you're willing and able, we will be back in touch. Okay. Right. If there's no other questions, I will move on to thank the rest of our panel. So Ria and Emma, thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to thank everyone who attended. Your contributions in the chat group have been fantastic. We are going to be sending out the recording as well as the full report. Again, you can go on the SimpsonScarborough CMO Study website and you can download all of these resources. And also thank you to Carrie. This is the end of the different chapters that we've been doing for the CMO study. And it is the end of an era and you've been behind so much of the work. So thank you to you. The sector owes you a great debt for releasing all of these chapters. So thank you. All right. Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone. And we look forward to connecting with some of you in person in Pittsburgh in June. Until then, take care and good luck back on your campuses. Cheers, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.